testimony of Assata Shakur, formerly Joanne Chesamard, who was arrested on the evening of May 2nd, 1973, along with Clark Squire and Zaid Malik Shakur, who was killed by the New Jersey. Assata Shakur, who is now in exile, was a former member of the Black Panther Party and a former member of the Black Liberation Army. Here, she gives testimony regarding her treatment after her capture by New Jersey police authorities.
Well, on the night of May 2nd, I was wounded. I was shot twice by the New Jersey State Police. I was kept on the floor for a while, on the ground. I was kicked, I was stomped, I was pulled. I was just dragged along by my hair. Finally, I was put into an ambulance, and the ambulance was kept waiting by the New Jersey State Police. The police would not let the ambulance leave until they authorized that the ambulance would finally move. And before they finally let the ambulance move, they kept coming back and asking the ambulance attendants, is she dead yet? Is she dead yet? And finally, when it was clear that I was not dead and I wasn't going to die in the next 5 or 10 minutes, they took me to the hospital, where between the doctors treating me and the police jumping on me, beating on me, choking me, doing everything that they could possibly do, I spent the night like that. As soon as the doctors or the nurses would go outside, the detectives would jump on me. And even though I was half dead and the hospital authorities had brought in a priest to give me what was last rites, the police would not stop torturing me. They would not stop beating me. They would not stop poking me. And, you know, they would say, bang, you know, does it hurt here? Do you feel bad? Do you feel sick here? And, you know, I mean, that went on all night until the next morning when I was taken to the intensive care unit. In the intensive care unit, well, they had to calm down for a while because there were so many nurses and doctors there. Then they moved me to another room, which was the Johnson & Johnson suite. And they closed off the exit from the hallway that went directly into the room where I was kept. And so the people had to go around, the nurses and the doctors had to go around through another room to get into the hospital room where I was, so they could virtually control all traffic in and out. And so it was just open season on me for about, I'd say, 3 or 4 days. I spent with either being beaten, poked, punched, with them putting something in my eyes, with every day was my last day. They turned up the air condition so that I was freezing to death. The nurses would come and turn it down. They would turn it back up again. My lungs were threatening to collapse, and they were, you know, trying to do everything so that I would get pneumonia.
Did the medical staff participate or acquiesce to this treatment while you were in under their care?
Some of them did and some of them didn't. The first night there was a doctor who was just as bad as the state troopers. I mean, he was why'd you shoot the trooper? I mean, he didn't know if I shot a trooper or not, but I mean, he just jumped on me just as if he believed that he was there on the turnpike. But then some of the nurses were very kind and very supportive and could really see what was happening and saw the viciousness of the police. And what happened was that on the, I don't know, it was the third or the fourth day I was there, one of them gave me a call button so that I could call whenever the state troopers came near my bed. And through that way I was able to avoid being further beat up. Also, you know, they had my leg cuffed to the bed, even though I was half dead, and my leg was swelling, and a lot of the nurses, not a lot, but one or two or three of the nurses protested constantly the way they had my foot cuffed because it was literally bleeding, literally, you know, sticking in the flesh.
Is it your opinion that if it were not for the medical staff being present, that the authorities would have murdered you at that hospital?
Well, that's obviously possible. Oh, okay. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay.
It's okay. So it is your opinion that were it not for the medical staff, the police authorities would have murdered you in that hospital with the complicity and compliance of certain doctors?
That's definitely a possibility.
Were these members of the medical staff that showed human compassion towards you, were they black, were they white, or were they both black and white?
Black and white. The one who gave me the call button was a German nurse. She had a German accent. Some of the black nurses, they sent me a little package of books, which really saved my life spiritually and in human terms, because that was one of the most difficult times of my life. And
all right, y'all, peace and blessings. That was some footage of Assata Shakur during her testimony to the 1990 tribunal. And if y'all want to see the whole footage of that, feel free to email us and we could send you the link. But let's get this webinar started. So thank you for attending and participating and joining in the Spirit of Mandela's Coalition 5th webinar, We Charge Genocide. My name is Emok, and I will be a co-facilitator tonight along with my comrade Tag. I am a member of In the Spirit of Mandela's coordinating committee, as well as social media, logistics, and outreach committees. And before I begin, I would like to take the time to just ground ourselves and participate if you can, and just to take the time to share thanks and appreciation for our ancestors. So thank you to our ancestors, our giant ancestors, whose shoulders we stand on, whose footsteps we follow, whose fight we carry on. Thank you for the sacrifices you made for us to be here today. Thank you for your love, support, guidance, and for choosing us to carry on the fight for emancipation, abolition, and liberation. Thank you to the spirits of the land, whose land we are living on now. I am on Nisenan land known as Sacramento. We acknowledge that the indigenous people of Turtle Island are still among us today. We understand that the land was never ceded and the original tribal families have yet to recover from the genocidal practices of the United States. And as a resident or visitor on the lands we live on, we support the indigenous people of the land and the right to self-determination and sovereignty through the stabilization of their people, homelands, and culture. Thank you. So for those of you new to this space, welcome. And for returning participants, we appreciate your commitment to the fight for human rights. These series of webinars leading up to the tribunal are all historical moments, so everyone here today is a part of history. All of our webinars are very important, but this one in particular will prepare you and help you understand the charges for this October's historical international tribunal, where we will be charging the United States for the genocide of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. If you haven't registered for the tribunal, please take the time to do so, and you could do that at spiritofmandela.org. The tribunal is this October 22nd to the 25th at the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center, the very location where Malcolm X was assassinated and took his last breath. The tribunal is also occurring on the 70th anniversary of Paul Robeson and William Patterson's original petition to the United Nations, We Charge Genocide, And here we are today in this October saying we charge genocide again. In the Spirit of Mandela Coalition has been planning for this historical tribunal for over 3 years after it was initiated by Julio Muntakeem in 2018 during his time as a captured freedom fighter, with the intention of carrying on Paul Robeson and William Patterson's effort, and we charge genocide petition. In 1951, Robeson and Patterson brought to the attention of the United Nations the historical chronological repression of Black freedom in the United States in a document that wasn't well received by the US. In fact, Patterson was chased around by agents of the US as a result of trying to have this petition submitted to the UN. The petition highlighted the United States' commitment to destroy Black, Brown, and Indigenous people through illegal genocidal practices, which is a crime under international law, specifically the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide Resolution. So in 2018, In the Spirit of Mandela was initiated and began the process of making and organizing a campaign to the international community for the issues of political prisoners existing in the United States and bringing back the question of genocide. So with all that said, we're here to say we charge genocide again. We charge for 1, the racist police killings of Black and Brown Indigenous people. 2, the hyper-incarceration of Black and Brown Indigenous people. 3, the political incarceration of civil rights era and national liberation era activists and present day activists. 4, we charge for the United States public health racism and its disparities and its impact on Black and Brown Indigenous people. 5, for environmental racism and its impact on Black and Brown Indigenous people. And lastly, 6, we are charging the United States for the genocide of Black and Brown and Indigenous people as a result of the historic and systemic charges of all of the above. So with all that said, we hope you leave this webinar with a better understanding of the charges, what they mean, the historical and present day context of these human rights violations, and with a commitment to stop this violent war against our humanity. So I believe now I pass it on to my comrade Tag, who will introduce tonight's panelists.
Much appreciated. Greatly appreciate that intro, Emma, and greatly appreciate everyone's presence here and those that will peep this out later on. And I am very much honored to introduce our panelists for tonight. And so I will do so starting with Agnes Williams. Agnes Williams is a Wolf Clan enrolled Seneca Haudenosaunee organizer and activist on the history and present conditions of genocide of Indigenous peoples, education, curriculum, environmental, women's, and social justice issues. She is coordinator of the Indigenous Women's Initiative in Buffalo, New York. Among its current campaigns are Water is Life, Nuclear Free Future, and Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery. She organized the last 10+ years annual celebration commemoration on August 9th, Indigenous Peoples Nuclear Free Future Day at the Buffalo History Museum to educate the public about the continued existence of Haudenosaunee peoples and the 2007 United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, providing Indigenous peoples right to be and have prior, free, and informed consent. Agnes is also appointed to the Climate Change Task Force of the Seneca Nation. Our second panelist, Errol Schweitzer, was born and raised in the Bronx. He started his food industry career as a deli clerk and grill cook in college and helped coordinate a student-run food co-op. After graduating, Errol worked on food justice and advocacy projects, including community-supported agriculture, farmers markets, and urban community gardens in the New York area. He did several stints as a community organizer in the Bronx and helped start a successful campaign to overturn New York's draconian Rockefeller drug laws. He eventually landed at Whole Foods as a stock clerk and worked his way up through a variety of store, regional, and national positions, including leading the New York, New Jersey grocery division from 2006 to 2008. He spent the next 7 years as vice president of grocery and was accountable for the merchandising and financial performance for over 80 product categories and $5 billion in annual sales. His team launched thousands of innovative new products into household names, including Zevia, Harvest, Suja, Beyond Meat, Justin's, Khalifa Farms, Maple Hill, Saffron Road, and popularized trends such as non-GMO verified, biodynamic, and fair trade, including pushing over 10,000 items through non-GMO verification. He helped implement procurement standards for pasture-raised eggs, grass-fed milk, green cleaning products, sustainable seafood, and plant-based foods, while achieving aggressive sales and profitability targets. Supermarket News has selected him as a Retailer of the Year, and Hemp Industries Association awarded him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Errol is a prolific public speaker and intellectual with a regular column in Forbes, a social media presence as Grocery Nerd, and a popular podcast on food, justice, and labor called The Checkout. Gerald Horne, our third panelist, is a leading and influential historian who currently holds the John J. and Rebecca Morse Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Horne was raised in St. Louis, Missouri. After undergraduate education at Princeton University, he received his PhD from Columbia University and a JD from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Horne has published on W.E.B. Du Bois and has written books on neglected episodes of world history. He writes about topics he perceives as misrepresented struggles for justice, in particular communist struggles and struggles against imperialism, colonialism, fascism, racism, and white supremacy. The author of more than 30 books, his research explores racism in a variety of contexts involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. Finally, our fourth panelist is Julio Muntakeem, an activist, author, and former member of the Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Army. During his 5 decades of incarceration, Muntaqim remained a pioneering leader within and without his prison walls. He initiated national campaigns for the United States to recognize the status of political prisoners who, like himself, fought for liberation in the face of state persecution, surveillance, and intimidation, and later helped to found an amnesty movement dedicated to freeing political prisoners and prisoners of war. He also earned multiple college degrees, mentored hundreds of people, and taught classes on sociology, African studies, poetry, IT, and other life skills. Released on parole in October 2020, and now at Citizen Action NY, Muntaqim lends his experience and knowledge of history to discuss the way forward from our present moment on policing, popular resistance, criminal injustice, and our collective imaginings for a more just, more humane future. And so again, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our panel for this, our 5th webinar, and we will start with Agnes Williams.
Greetings of Thanksgiving to all the people. And in our tradition as Haudenosaunee people, this is the business before all business, as the words before all else. That as we come together, we extend a greeting, an acknowledgement of one another, and a thanksgiving for our lives and everything that we have here within this creation. And then we ask that everything continue on as it originally instructed, so that life will continue within this creation. Now there's 16 parts to this, and each speaker will go about their business and look around in the spiral from themselves all the way up to the heavens. And I'm not going to go that far tonight because our time is limited, but we've given a greetings and thanksgiving for all the people that are here special greetings and Thanksgiving to all the participants who have joined us tonight. A special greetings and Thanksgiving to my distinguished colleagues that I share the panel with, and to our hosts and the people that have made it, have done the work to put this together, that we can all be here together tonight. And I ask that we all continue on as originally instructed, so that life will continue within this creation. And as we go through and look about, we give a special greetings and Thanksgiving for our Mother, the Earth, who supports our feet and continues on with her original instructions to take care of us, to provide everything we need, to nurture us, to give us the water, the air, everything that we need in order to survive. So at this time, I'd like to give a greetings and Thanksgiving to our Mother, the Earth, and ask that she continue on as originally instructed. And I ask that we all put our minds together as one and ask that she continue on as originally instructed. And as we look about us, we see the waters. I like to extend a special greetings and Thanksgiving for the waters, because without the waters, we wouldn't exist. The big waters, the small waters, and the waters that our bodies 70% is made up of. And ask that the waters continue on as they were originally instructed, so that life will continue within this creation. So if we can put our minds together now and extend that greetings and Thanksgiving for the waters, extend the greetings and Thanksgiving for all of the plants and the animals and all of the things in creation. I'm not going to be able to enumerate here tonight, but anything special that we all have in our own minds that we hold especially near and dear to our hearts, we'd like to give a greetings and Thanksgiving for, and put our minds together as one for all those things that we've forgotten because we get forgetful, all those things that we haven't learned yet because there's so many things that we're still yet to learn, for all those things that we're never going to know during this time that we have here within this creation. So to include special greetings and Thanksgiving for all those things, and I'd ask us all to put our minds together as one and extend the greetings and Thanksgiving, and ask that they all continue on as originally instructed, so that life will continue within this creation. And finally, we ask that extend a greetings and Thanksgiving to the great mystery for making it all possible. Now that in our tradition and language is what we call the words before else, or the Gonyonyo in the Seneca language. And it's something that we do every day and every night because we never know when our time is going to be up here. You know, we all know that, you know, we only have a certain amount of time here. So that is part of our way of whenever the people gather to do that and to remind ourselves of everything that we have within this creation. Now, I've been asked tonight to give a brief history. A lot of people, when they talk about Indigenous people, that particular word, to my knowledge, came to me during the 70s when we started to go to the United Nations. And early in the 70s, 1973, I'm sure many of you are aware, there was the independent Oglala Nation declared itself independent of the United States. And the US government reacted and came in, gun shooting and killing and into Wounded Knee, South Dakota. And years later, during the trials of Leonard Peltier, political prisoner, we found out about this national sacrifice plan that was in store for the Badlands, that the governors in the United States meet in regions and they decide the United States has this policy, national sacrifice policy. They decide, you know, where these industrial wastes are going to go. And in this particular instance, it was nuclear waste. So the Badlands had been targeted as a place for nuclear waste. And when 1973, when the Oglala Band of the Great Sioux Nation declared itself an independent sovereign nation, there was a huge reaction, because this plan, is part of a larger policy and economic paradigm that we've been living under since day one. The development of the first and the second world is dependent and really can't exist without, is dependent upon the underdevelopment of the third world workers and no development of the fourth world indigenous peoples. And case in point, with Wounded Knee in 1973 and the national sacrifice area of the Badlands that was supposed to be used to store nuclear waste, because they had a mineral tectosite they thought that would insulate the nuclear waste. Unfortunately, the nuclear industry still hasn't found a good way to contain the nuclear waste. And indigenous people are on the beginning and the end of a nuclear chain. Now, people will try to tell you it's a cycle because they're trying to make you think it's natural, but it's not natural. It's definitely has a beginning. It starts with uranium mining, indigenous lands, and it ends with nuclear waste disposal, again, on indigenous lands. Another national sacrifice. In the Southwest, in the 70s, the uranium mining that went on resulted in, for the Navajo Nation, millings and tailings that are still there and still haven't been successfully contained. And when that industry was shut down, they left the Southwest of the United States and they went to Canada, to Saskatchewan, again to Indian country, and they went to South Africa for the uranium mining. And we're still in the middle of what people will call nuclear development, or they'll call it clean energy, which it isn't clean energy, but that we haven't found a way to successfully contain the waste from the mining and the waste disposal of the nuclear. So when that happened in 1973, and the Oglalas suffered, after a 71-day siege there, that was when the decision was made by the Oglalas to form the International Indian Treaty Council as an NGO and to go to the United Nations, because it was clear to us, and has been clear to us for over 500 years, that we're in a way, and our best interests are not being looked after by the United States. So we went to the United Nations, only to find out in 1977 that we couldn't go in. And we said, well, why can't we go in the United Nations? They said, well, your populations, you're not considered human beings, so you can't participate because United Nations is a nation state organization, and you're only populations. So come to find out, in that first meeting, we got to go into the UN, but with our not NGO friends, and participate only by listening, and to start to study and how to gain a seat at the table and to become recognized that we are human beings. So that was in 1977. 1975, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Leonard Peltier, and from 73 to 75, there was a civil war going on in the Pine Ridge Reservation, 500 unsolved murders. And by 1973, the FBI's drove in and there was a shootout at the Jumping Bull home, and there were people killed, and FBI agents, and Leonard Peltier is targeted, has been in jail for 45 years, and is still in jail. We're still trying to get him out. And even as the ballistics on the evidence did not match the ballistics of his rifle. So somebody, you know, I guess they felt somebody had to pay for that. And of course, again, it was the Indians. So that was in 1975. And then in 1976, there was the members of the leadership in the American Indian movement. After that shootout, were on the run. Dennis Beggs and Leonard were on the run. And Dennis, they captured Leonard, and Dennis gained asylum in California. Governor Brown gave him an asylum. And by 1977, Dennis had rallied many, many Native people who had been forcibly relocated out of the boarding schools, which is another genocidal policy of the United States. You know, we have this history of disease, war, removal, relocation, and then assimilation. And then there was supposed to be no more Indians. Well, this part of this removal was removal from the reservations into the boarding schools, and children would stay there from age 5 to 18, and then they were removed. They graduated, and then they were relocated into urban areas. So by 1976, most of the population, the majority of the population were urban, where just 10 years before that, they were mostly rural. 70% of the population, Native population, was rural. So all these policies, all these genocidal policies, all have been geared to get rid of us and to do away with us, you know, so that we would no longer exist. We are in the way of the development of the first and second worlds. We are only needed for the use of the natural resources, which during this period of time is when we found out, you did from the tacticite, and also the fact that 70% of the natural resources in the United States are on Indian land. So we're not going anywhere. You know, there's a lot of us still here, but we're invisible, and we continue to be invisible. And I'm very thankful for being invited today to participate, because it's, and one of the reasons why I am here is because these are one of the things that, you know, most people think that all the Indians are in the plains, and there are Indians on the East Coast. There's Indians all over, you know, there's many of us. We always ask people to think about whose land they're on, you know, whose land you're on. And I want to thank you for the land acknowledgement that was done in the beginning of the tribunal. So all of this policy comes up. So by 1977, Banks had gotten asylum in California, and in 1977 on New Year's Eve, there were 11 pieces of anti-Indian and legislation in Congress, and they were started by the sports people and the fishermen. They didn't like the Indians. They were in their way up in the Northwest, and they didn't like them fishing, because most of our people, indigenous people, you know, that's part of being the definition of being indigenous, is that we still subsist off the land, and we live very close to the land. So anything that happens to the land happens to us immediately. And so they put in these 11 pieces of anti-Indian legislation in order to terminate what they call our trust status, which is a government, a US government idea that is based in our treaties. We all have treaties for our land and the different resources that we have. So this anti-Indian legislation was coming up, And in Sacramento, we had a New Year's Eve powwow. It was actually in Davis. And Dennis Banks and the American Indian Movement had a meeting, and they decided they needed to do something about these 11 pieces of anti-Indian legislation. And so Dennis came out and he announced that the American Indian Movement was going to walk from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. in protest of this anti-Indian legislation. And the first person to volunteer was Jimbo Simmons, because he was a Choctaw, and because he stood up and he said he was going to be the first one to walk because his ancestors had been forcibly removed from the southeast of the United States into the Oklahoma territories. And so there it started. We started on Alcatraz Island with pipe ceremonies. We motorcaded to the Capitol, and 500 people started walking in February to Washington, D.C. And in the first 24 hours, we were already in Nevada. And by Monday morning, because we started on the weekend, everybody was calling into work saying, I can't come to work today because we're all still walking in Nevada. So as we organized on our way, all the people from the North, all the indigenous people, the Native people from the North, and the Native people, the medicine people had heard about this. But this wasn't the first time they had heard about this, because they had heard about it through our prophecies. And they knew that this was going to happen. So we just don't know when. And everybody recognized that this was it. So we walked across the country. And when we arrived in Washington, D.C., we had 30,000 people that were walking with us. And we successfully defeated that anti-Indian legislation. So that was 1978. And then the summer after that, we formed the organization Women of All Red Nations. And there was mostly the Plains women in South Dakota. We went to the Mother Butler Center in Rapid City and had a meeting. And we started our central committee. And 6 weeks later in Congress, congressmen stood up and they said that there were terrorist organizations in the United States, the Black Panther Party, the Brown Berets, and the American Indian Movement, and splinter groups like the Women of All Red Nations. So we had already been labeled and named and been sentenced, So it was in 1979 with Horne, we published our first booklet. On our central committee, we had a person, we all had different areas that we worked in. And Dr. Connie Urey in Los Angeles had been studying the forced sterilization of Indigenous women, and she published a report on that. And that was one of the first documents that had been taken to the United Nations in the late 70s, because after 77, we first went, we started to go every year and participate as an NGO and to make testimony about the genocidal practices and the forced sterilization of Native women in Indian health services hospitals.
Miss Agnes,
yes.
Can you, we got to transition to the other panelists. Can you please take the time to close out? Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah, you want to close out? You want to wrap up your presentation?
I don't know. I was told I had 20 minutes. So.
No, I'm so sorry. No, it was 15.
Yeah, and I was told that last week. So, okay, so that was I was still in the 70s. So Leonard was in jail in 1979, and we went to the Supreme Court building, held a vigil for 3 months to try to get the Supreme Court to hear his case. And on March 5th, they brought in the ruling. But before that, the month before, our leader there, John Trudell, his family in Nevada, he was married to Tina Trudell, who was an activist, and her and her family were burned up in a fire. And she was pregnant. Her 3 children, her mother and herself, were all killed in that fire. And that was very devastating, and to all of us, because we knew, because of the work that we were doing, and because we were, fighting for Leonard Peltier, that this was all connected. So by 1983, the Hopi prophecy was followed by Janet McLeod, and she was our leader in the Northwest in the Fisheries struggle. And she brought together, in the Hopi prophecy, it talks about that the women are going to rise, and because life itself is threatened. And so she went around and she gathered us up, and we formed an organization called the Indigenous Women's Network. And we do have property in Austin, Texas, Alma de Mujer, which is a retreat center. We've tried to keep that as a sustainable community. We had a magazine that we published. Our members on that was Winona LaDuke, who birthed the Honor the Earth, and is now fighting Line 3 in Minnesota, trying to stop the transmission of tar sands oil that is the tar sands project in Alberta, Canada, which is pouring 1/4 of the carbon into the atmosphere on a daily basis. So all the Indians now are out there fighting these pipelines, and it's because of that oil that they're trying to stop that production of in northern in Alberta. So see, there was one more thing I wanted to say before I'm done. And through all this, I didn't say too much about the Haudenosaunee, but on the other end, I was living in California most of that time, and in '85 I returned home. But here in Buffalo and American Studies, the Haudenosaunee, Jomahawk, or Mohawk, Orin Lions were doing work in the United Nations. They published a couple books that people might want to look at, Basic Call to Consciousness. And they were going to the UN on a regular basis. And as the Haudenosaunee, we have because we still live on our original territory, we still occupy, continue, and we're one of the oldest continuing governments, along with the Hopi and others in North America. We have one of the strongest land cases in land claims in the United Nations. And in 2007, one of our lawyers, Tanya Frischner, negotiated with the Chinese to help get the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People passed, which they didn't think was going to happen until 2030. And if anybody needs to or wants to know what Indigenous people want, that document was worked on for 30 years and hammered out by Indigenous people all over the world. And it's a very good document. It's not perfect. There's things in there that could be better, but we have something now. So with the organizing, the activism, now we have something to say, this is what we want. And in there, that is the other flip side of the genocide. And I encourage everybody to look at that, to study that, and to use that in all your references in the Genocide Tribunal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnes. Beautiful presentation. We have some questions in the chat, but we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. But thank you so much for breaking down the genocidal policies and free Leonard and free the people and free the land. So right now we are gonna transition to Errol. you are up next. Would like to kick it off.
Thank you. So my name is Errol Schweitzer. In the next few minutes, I'm going to lay out the case for the U.S. food system as a food apartheid system. So setting the table, the origins of the U.S. food system, a quote from Professor Raj Patel: "From farm to fork, America's food system has been rooted in the exploitation of women, Native Americans, and people of color. This is at the heart of the capitalist food politics, big corporations taking as much as they can and paying as little as possible for it." So the US food system is rooted in the slave trade, plantation economics, and the genocide and dispossession of Native Americans. After the Civil War, land was given away to white settlers, including the Homestead Act and the Dawes Act. At the same time, Reconstruction failed in the South. Native American lands were appropriated, and Japanese and Chinese Americans were precluded from land ownership. In the 20th century, thousands of Black farmers were displaced from farms they had built during Reconstruction. The consolidation of rural land benefited white landowners and conventional agribusiness. Farm workers still lack basic labor protections that were excluded from New Deal labor reforms. The food system, and hence all production and consumption, is rooted in this history of injustice. So why do we say food apartheid? A quote from Karen Washington, a farmer from the Bronx, my hometown, as well as a cooperative farmer from Rise and Root Farm. Karen says, "Instead of food desert, we say food apartheid, because food apartheid looks at the whole food system along with race, geography, faith, and economics. You say food apartheid and you get to the root cause of some of the problems around the food system." So food apartheid facts: 43.5% of Americans live in poverty or are low income. Racial disparities in food insecurity: 21% of Black and 17% of Latin American households experience food insecurity in 2020. White households facing food insecurity have declined to 7%. In the week before Christmas 2020, about 81 million Americans experienced food insecurity, 1 in 4 people. Locally, where I currently live in Austin, 1 in 5 Austinites regularly face food insecurity. In late June 2020, 27.5% of households with children were food insecure, over 13.9 children. 1 in 3 households led by single women with children are currently food insecure. In 2020, US federal spending on food and nutritional assistance reached a record high $122 billion, including through SNAP, WIC, and pandemic EBT. 42 million people, about 20% of US adults, and 22.1 million households were enrolled in SNAP as of April 2021. In 2020, at least 60 million Americans relied on food banks or food pantries. 80% of those who got stimulus checks in 2020 spent it on food. Exploitation and wealth extraction. Low wages are key to understanding why so many Americans experience food insecurity. Many workers, even working full-time, can't cover the basic costs of living. The federal minimum wage has been $7.25 since 2009. Median hourly wage for persons of color is 22% lower than for white Americans. Essential workers have faced decades of wage stagnation. If wages had kept pace with productivity since 1975, we would have a $24 an hour minimum wage. If minimum wages had increased at the same rate as Wall Street bonuses since 1985, it would be $44 an hour. Working class people have been robbed of nearly $50 trillion in income since 1975, over $2.5 trillion annually. 22.2 million jobs are related to food and ag in the US, over 11% of total US employment. At least half of the top 10 lowest paid jobs in the US are in the food industry. Farm workers have little protection from long hours, repetitive stress injuries, exposure to pesticides, dangerous machinery, extreme heat, and animal waste. Between 50 and 75% of the country's 2.5 million farm workers are undocumented. In New York City, the average hourly net pay of immigrant app-based delivery workers, such as for DoorDash or Grubhub, is $7.87. 49% have been involved in an accident while doing the delivery. 54% have experienced bike theft, 30% said they were assaulted, and over 83% report being denied access to bathroom breaks. Externalized costs and subsidies in the US food system. In 2019, American consumers spent an estimated $1.1 trillion on food. That price tag does not include the cost of healthcare for diet-related diseases or the cost of the food system's contributions to pollution, reduced biodiversity, or greenhouse gas emissions. Take those costs into account, and the true cost of the US food system is $3.2 trillion per year. The true cost of food disproportionately burdens people of color. Rates of diagnosed diabetes are 1.7 times higher in Latin Americans and 1.5 times higher in Black Americans than in white Americans. Air pollution exposure is 25% higher for Black Americans compared to the national average. Indigenous Americans are 19 times more likely to have reduced water and sanitation. Black Americans shoulder 1.3 times the proportional burden and cost of exposure to pesticides and fertilizers. Large conventional farmers have received up to $65 billion in subsidies from the Trump administration, and the meat industry regularly annually receives up to $38 billion in subsidies, and 99.9% of these subsidies benefit white farmers. The corporate control of the food system. The food industry spent $175 million on political contributions in 2020. Just 4 companies, Walmart, Costco, Kroger, and Ahold, control 65% of the retail market. Only 15 cents of every dollar we spend in the supermarket goes to farmers. The rest goes to processing and marketing. A handful of powerful companies control the majority market share of almost all grocery items regularly bought by Americans. Retailers leverage the pandemic to generate enormous profits for shareholders and executives while sharing little with workers. Jeff Bezos earned $73 billion early in the pandemic, while Amazon workers got just 95 cents extra per hour. The Walton family, majority shareholder of Walmart, added $45 billion to their wealth. Meanwhile, Walmart workers got 63 cents per hour extra. Kroger canceled Hero Pay early on, yet has authorized over $2 billion in stock buybacks and reported a 90% jump in profits. Grocery chains, however, are the main beneficiaries of food aid. In 2020, 82% of all food stamps were spent in supermarkets, which meant that taxpayers contributed $64 billion to their revenue. So as an end note, the COVID-19 impact. At least 1,450 meatpacking and food processing plants and 438 farms and production facilities had confirmed cases of COVID-19. At least 91,000 processing workers, 39,000 grocery workers have tested positive for COVID-19, and at least 465 processing and 178 grocery workers have died. Thousands more family members of food system workers also got sick and or died from COVID-19. Many who caught the virus still experience symptoms, and many essential workers are still fearful for their safety and angry at working conditions. Stress and trauma are widespread and are compounded by low pay, long hours, angry customers, and many of the issues already discussed. The COVID-19 pandemic held up a mirror to our food system. The pandemic ratified the failure of the industrial food system and showed the depth of structural inequalities, exploitation, racism, and sexism prevalent in our societies, exacerbating their consequences on hunger, health, and poverty. This is food apartheid. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Errol, and thank you for just breaking down really charge of environmental racism and why using the vocabulary food apartheid is important, right? This is all intentional. But would like to just transition and keep it pushing. Gerald, Mr. Horne, if you would like to go next, turn your camera on.
Thank you very much. And in my few minutes, and you should turn on my video, I assume. Thank you very much. In my few minutes, I'm going to speak about the most successful, quote unquote, attempt to charge genocide and take the United States and put it in the dock at the United Nations. I'm speaking of the We Charge Genocide campaign of approximately 70 years ago. A tip to the audience, I've written about this in a biography of William Patterson and a book on the organization that spearheaded the effort, the Civil Rights Congress, which came out 30 years ago, but it'll be in paperback in a few weeks. And so for more detail, I would point you to those 2 volumes. The executive summary of my remarks is that one of the reasons why this earlier petition made such a splash, which we should take note of, is number one, it had organizational heft behind it, not only in terms of the Civil Rights Congress in the United States of America, but its connection indirectly and sometimes directly to communist parties and their affiliates worldwide. Secondly, it was based upon a global analysis of the correlation of forces. That is to say, before you go into battle, unless you're General Custer, you should have some notion of what the order of battle is and who you're facing, what your strengths are, what their weaknesses are. And thirdly, they had global allies, as reflected in point number 1. Now, the petition was filed in New York by Paul Robeson, the great late actor and activist, filed in Paris at the United Nations by his comrade, William Patterson, Black lawyer out of San Francisco. As noted, filed on behalf of the Civil Rights Congress, which was an organization that came together in 1946 as a successor to the old International Labor Defense, which had arisen in the 1930s to help to rescue the Scottsboro 9 Black youth charged maliciously and falsely with sexual molestation of 2 Euro-American women in Alabama, headed to the death penalty before this global movement rescues them and eventually frees them. It serves as a precedent for how we internationalize the struggle against apartheid, appropriate to note given our theme of In the Spirit of Mandela. And this internationalizing of the struggle against Jim Crow, white supremacy, and domestic repression was critical to how we got to where we are today. I should also mention that the Civil Rights Congress nationally had about 10,000 members before it was driven out of business by dint of state repression in the middle 1950s. It had also, I should say, strong chapters in New York, Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco Bay Area, Seattle, and Los Angeles. The book that they published detailing the charges that were to place the United States in the dock sold thousands of copies worldwide and therefore turned into a fundraising engine. Indeed, US prisoners of war, particularly Black prisoners of war on the Korean Peninsula in the early 1950s were handed a copy of the genocide petition, that is to say, Black prisoners of war who had been fighting on behalf of US imperialism in Korea. I should also say that this effort rises in the context of a changing political atmosphere. This is part of what I mean by making an analysis of the forces before you charge into battle. That is to say, post-1945, at least in the Black community, which was the major focus of the genocide petition, there were 3 major ideological trends. There was a kind of liberal trend as represented by the NAACP. There was a nationalist trend, which had been weakened as a result of many of the nationalist leaders supporting Japan during World War II, with leading to many of them being jailed. And then there was a left-wing trend, symbolized by Robeson and Patterson and the forces around them. What happens is that the liberal trend is co-opted, that is to say the NAACP decides to join the Cold War and the Red Scare and helps to throw brickbats at Robeson and Patterson. The United States, that is to say US imperialism, was in a jam because it was on the one hand, trying to appeal to Africans surging to independence in the post-1945 era, ditto for the Caribbean, but at the same time, we're treating people of African descent in the United States so atrociously by dint of the Jim Crow or US apartheid system. So in that context, the NAACP was co-opted. Oftentimes, anti-Jim Crow concessions were channeled through their offices, quite figuratively, whereas Patterson wound up being jailed. Robeson's passport was snatched, which meant he could not go abroad to raise funds. His concerts in the United States oftentimes were attacked by fascist mobs, not least in Peekskill, New York, which happens right before the genocide petition, speaking of the attack in the summer of 1949. However, the problem with the NAACP approach, which at the time many thought was a wise decision since it's led to significant anti-Jim Crow concessions, was that it did not extend to economic rights, which meant that their constituency, which was mostly working class, had the so-called right to check into a hotel, but because of the simultaneous attack on unions, organizations of working class people, of which Black people were a preeminent element, they didn't have the money to pay the bill when the time came to check out of the hotel. When you had forces post-Civil Rights Congress, post-1956, such as Martin Luther King, who tried to raise up these questions of internationalism, oftentimes in conjunction with the left-wing forces that had been persecuted in the 1950s. Speaking of his opposition to the Vietnam War, we see that he was slain in April 1968 before his particular effort could take flight. Then you had organizations like the Black Panther Party, which for a time, as I note in my biography of William Patterson, he helped to counsel this organization. However, because of state repression and some internal errors, they were not able to survive as well. Today, I think that there are many opportunities in terms of doing a global analysis for the kind of effort that we are suggesting today. Let me point out, for example, just the news in the past few weeks. I point to the rift between France and the United States over France, according to their foreign minister, being stabbed in the back when the United States forces Australia to back out of a submarine deal that would have brought billions of dollars to French coffers, and Australia, in order to stay in the good graces of the United States, instead accepts US submarines. Keep in mind that even as we speak, there are skyjackers and Black Panther leaders who France refused to extradite and are spending their old age in France. So there is this contradiction that's emerging between France and the United States that we could well take advantage of in terms of seeking alliances. Secondly, of course, the submarine deal implicates the People's Republic of China. And if you looked at Mr. Biden's speech this morning, even though he barely mentioned China's name, we're in the midst of a new Cold War with China, not unlike Cold War I, we're now in Cold War II. And then just this month, the African Union and the Caribbean community had a virtual summit, which everybody agreed was the companion to the Pan-Africanist Congress of 1945 in Manchester. They hammered out a common agenda. Sadly and unfortunately, there were no Black Americans participating, which is a direct result of the unfortunate compromises our organizations made in the 1950s. However, I think that that opens up many possibilities. Likewise, just a day or two ago, there was a major summit in Mexico City marking not only the 200th anniversary of Mexican independence, but the attempt of Caribbean and Latin American nations to knock together a bloc that excludes the United States and would be the kind of equivalent of the European Union, if not the African Union. And then, of course, Cuba was involved in that Mexico City effort. President Diaz-Canel had a starring role. And we all know, as you just saw, about how Cuba has provided a kind of rear base to our militants, such as Assata Shakur. And I need not remind you, I'm sure, of the continuing contradictions between Moscow and Washington. And I could go on in this vein because a superpower, a US imperialist power, over the decades accumulates many antagonists who are willing, more than willing, to come to our defense. Now, I think one of the questions remains, can African Americans in particular, and I would say generally the US left and progressive forces as a whole, get up to speed through political education to be able to do a reasonable kind of analysis? Because I have to say that there are few organizations and intellectuals today who are capable of doing the kind of global analysis that we so desperately need. And let me also remind you that this reliance among global forces is not new. The great Tecumseh, for example, died fighting shoulder to shoulder with British forces against the settlers during the War of 1812. We all know about the impact of the Haitian Revolution, which ignited a general crisis of the entire slave system. that could only be resolved with this collapse, which it did in North America in 1865. And I just made reference to the impact of Cold War I. So historically, we have been heavily reliant upon these kinds of external factors because the domestic forces are oftentimes skewed against us, which brings me to my final point. The book that's capturing all the headlines by Washington Post writer Bob Woodward and his colleague Robert Costa, which talks about not only did we barely escape a right-wing coup d'etat in January 2021, which even then CIA Director Gina Haspel acknowledged, but unbeknownst to many of us, we might have escaped Armageddon as well, since the 45th US president apparently had in mind doing a preemptive military strike on the People's Republic of China so he could declare a national emergency so he could stay in office. So my friends, we have a lot of work ahead of us. I'm sure we're up to the task, and thank you for your attention. Over.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Horne, for those words. And I would like to just shift us from those words and that analysis to Brother Jalil Muntakeem, our final speaker and panelist for the night, and also the one who first conceptualized this campaign here called In the Spirit of Mandela years ago. So thanks so much to all of our panelists, and the floor is yours, Brother Jalil.
Thank you, Tag. First of all, Assalamu alaikum, Guten Tag, peace, paz, and whatever Habaragani, whatever language you use that expresses the idea of peace and harmony, I share that with you. I want to thank also all the panelists who are brought to us an understanding why we have brought this issue of genocide, the importance of bringing this issue of genocide, why it is necessary for us to raise our question, raise our issue, raise our concerns to the international community. Tag, you still got your thing up, Tag. Let me just make this point, and I want to put this in as clearly as I possibly can. The question of international, or the question of genocide by the International Convention on Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide states the following. I'm going to make everybody understand why these charges are being made in context of what we have heard today and what we have heard in the last webinars going forward. Let me ask this question first. Hey, Tag, can everybody see me? Can I see your
Yes, no, we can see you.
Okay, well, only thing I see your tag up here in focus.
No, I just closed my video, so that came up, but your screen is in focus.
Okay, all right. So the International Convention on Prevention and Punishment of Crime states the following. The present Convention of Genocide means any of the following and committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part the ethnic, national, racial, or religious group, such as 1, killing members of the group, 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm of members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical construction in whole or in part, 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. I think we've heard all of that tonight. Respecting in regards to the issues of a Native American Indigenous community, as well as it has an effect on Black community, as well as it has an effect on the Latinas community, particularly in the issue of question of sterilization of Black women, sterilization of brown women, sterilization of Native American women, issues of deliberately inflicting the issues of destruction in whole or in part, or the transferring of children. Right, as our sister Agnes had made mention, regards to the Native American indigenous community, as well as it has the foster care system that has a preeminent numbers of or a large amount of Black and the brown people in that community, in those systems of oppression. Thank you. Article 3 further indicates that the following shall be punishable: genocides, B, conspiracy to commit genocides, direct and public incitement to commit genocides, attempt to commit genocides, and the complicity to commit genocides. And I think we covered everything in regards to what we have shared tonight, what we have shared in the last webinars, that the conditions from which Black people, brown people, Native American, indigenous people have suffered in this country tantamounts to genocides. And it behooves us to raise this question to the international community. Dr. Horne raised some very important parts of our understanding of what our relationship is to the international community. In the previous years, we have been one who has committed ourselves in support of other people's struggles against national liberation, independence, and colonialism. Fighting against colonialism, fighting for national liberation and independence. All right? But yet, we have not turned that conditions, that understanding around for us in our understanding of international solidarity with the struggle of us, Black people in America. Right? Most recent with the Black Lives Matter trend, consciousness, we find that there's people all around the world have rised up to the understanding that Black Lives Matter as basis of that trend, that social consciousness movement. But how do we turn that understanding into something practical and real and pragmatic in regards to our struggle? Right? And this is what we need to do today. Right? There are efforts to build a campaign of internationalism, a campaign of national solidarity, a campaign for freedom based upon the conditions of genocides is here now today. We're not only commemorating the 70th anniversary of Paul Robeson and William Patterson, we are saying that we are committed to the same ideas that they did today, genocides today. All right, so I'm gonna give a broader, general understanding of what I'm saying in this context. As my brother Errol has made mention about food apartheid and the industries, food industries, and how they are committed to exploiting the general public. There are 540 billionaires in the United States. 540 billionaires in the United States. Put this in context. I want you to understand what I'm saying. 540 billionaires. And they have the accumulated wealth of $2.399 trillion. They have the equivalent wealth of all of Western Europe. 540 billionaires. All right? However, there are 331 million people in the United States. And so we see this capitalist system allows for 540 people to basically control the wealth of this country. We are complicit in that. We are allowing that to happen by our understanding and our relationship to the system of capitalism. That has to be challenged. We have to understand that we have to internalize that understanding that this system allows these individuals to hoard wealth to our detriment, to the conditions of genocides of peoples. Not only here in the United States, but also throughout the world. Right? These wars of liberation and independence against colonialism, neocolonialism, based upon a war against what? U.S. capitalism and imperialism. And the world is waiting on us. Truth of the matter is, the world is waiting on us. What the hell are we going to do here in the belly of the beast? We have been complicit. We have blood on our hands because of our silence, because of our failure to engage. Dr. Horne just told us in various parts of the world that people are converging, developing coalitions in opposition to U.S. imperialism. They are tired. They are tired against this fight. Why aren't we? Why have we not decided that it's time for us to end this? To end this. And so this is what we're talking about here today in regards to our petition to the United Nations, our petition to the United Nations, but our International Tribunal in October. We are bringing to the international community our fight. Right? And we're asking for the solidarity of the international community in support of our fight. We're raising this for the purpose of saving the babies. All right? At one time when I was a kid, I thought we were going to have a struggle in my lifetime. That's not going to happen. As Dr. Horne has also raised, right? That is generational. Okay. But the work that we do today make it less of the work that needs to be done in the future. But we have to engage. We have to get organized. We have to build the kinds of institutions of resistance, Black resistance, brown resistance, red resistance to white supremacy. Dr. Horne made mention what happened on January 6th. On January 6th was a prelude of the potential for a new civil war in this country. We are silent at the wheel. We have to wake up. We have to be prepared to engage. So I'm asking everyone watching this webinar, when this thing comes out in YouTube or whatever social media networks they are, I don't know them all. Remember, I've only been out almost a year, right? Whatever it is, share it. And ensure that other people join in support of, endorse the International Tribunal, as Dr. Horne said. We have to get organized. Moving forward in 2022, look for us to be again building toward the People's Senate. There has to be another narrative going forward. The corporate parties, Democratic and Republican parties, don't work in our best interest. Has not and will not. They work in the interest of the capitalist class. Right? So there needs to be a new narrative in this country, a third wave in this country. And we're going to move toward building that in 2022. Right? We'll build a People's Senate. We're going to move toward building a National United Front. And we're going to link that National United Front with the international community. We're going to build a base from which we can actually move towards having international solidarity, domestically and international. That's the charge moving forward. I want to thank everyone who participated in this webinar and the last 4 webinars. I'm hoping that each and every one of you have gotten a clear understanding of why the charge of genocide is being made, not only in terms of commemoration of Paul Robeson and William Patterson, but towards the idea of saving our own lives. Right? The white supremacists are on the move. They're on the march. We got to know that. They declared it on January 6th. I believe them. Thank you. Tag? Emok?
Yes. Thank you for those remarks. And thank you to all of the panelists for all of the important insight and analysis that you've provided tonight. And there are a number of questions. So we're going to now go into the Q&A portion of the webinar. And so I will hand it over to Emuk to start us off with the first question from the participants who sent questions in.
Most definitely. And can all the panelists tonight please turn your video on, and we'll just ask all the questions. So the first question is, the United States has reinforced past strategies to silence current and younger political prisoners. How can our movements prepare / disempower possible disruption to this amazing effort throughout the International Tribunal?
I guess I need to answer that.
Yes.
We have to build, first of all, people need to join Jericho. Need to join the National Northeast Coalition for Political Prisoners. Right? You need to join ABCF, support of political prisoners. You need to join an organization. You need to be part of an organization. You need to build what Kwame Ture had told us, that we need to organize, as Dr. Horne reminded us. We need to organize. We have to get organized, right? And we have to unify. We have to have unity and uniformity, right? And building a base from which we can move forward. Jericho is one of the mechanisms, the oldest mechanism to support political prisoners. All right, we've been supporting Comrade Leonard Peltier from the very beginning, right, and many others. Comrade David Gilbert may be getting out soon, We don't know. But we have fought for him and many others. So join one of the organizations and support the political prisoners, right? Increase our numbers. When you increase our numbers, you increase our voice, you increase our power, right? So that's how we begin to, and also we establish international support and solidarity with our own political prisoners and the movements that we're building towards. Our comrades, leadership, as a matter of fact, Jihad Mohammed, the chairman of Jericho, has been to Geneva a couple of times, raising our concerns to the international community at the United Nations in Geneva. And so we will continue in that process and build on that process. But we need to increase our numbers. We need to build out our chapters across the country, right? Join Jericho, build a Jericho cadre, a chapter in your town, your city, in your hamlet, wherever you may be, right? Write our political prisoners and support them on a very direct way. Dr. Horne, do you want to add to that?
No, I think you summed it up nicely. And just to reiterate a point I made earlier, as noted, 70 years ago, the book, We Charge Genocide, became a fundraiser. It was sold all over the world. And that kind of book is something that the 2021 movement may want to consider.
Indeed, Dr. Horne, and I'm glad you raised that, because we intend to have the documentations that we're going to have at the International Tribunal put into a book. Not only that, Dr. Horne, we intend to, after the tribunal, to file federal charges. Based upon the decision of the International Tribunal, the international jurors will be filing federal charges in civil court, and we will continue to build out our campaign on the basis of the civil complaint that we're going to bring to in civil court, and build our campaign even further to ensure that we have support base from various segments of the country in support of the civil rights action itself. So we're not giving up on this. This is the International Tribunal for us to build outward into the international community, but then we also build domestically in terms of bringing these charges into the court, so that the United States has to answer the charges. They have to answer the charges in the civil complaint, and we'll continue to build out our movement on the basis of that civil complaint. Many, as was done many times by our eminent leaders during the civil rights movement, when they used the courts as a mechanism to build movement.
Should I?
Agnes. Go ahead.
No, please. Were you gonna?
Yes, I just wanted to mention when we talk about the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the work being done in the United Nations is to bring the declaration to become a convention. Once it becomes a convention, then it becomes international law, and the nation states can be brought to international court for violations of that law. The first step on grassroots adoption, I would like to propose that the tribunal adopt the declaration as a working document, and any other organizations connected to the tribunal that they also adopt it. Once it's adopted on a grassroots level, and then each of the countries adopt these declarations, then the nation state pushes forward with turning it into a convention, just like the Human Rights Convention.
Thank you, Agnes. We'll bring that to the attention of our legal team, our Sister Nikichi Taifa, who will be our lead prosecutor for the tribunal. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. And then one last question for the night. And then Agnes and Errol, there are some follow-ups with you that people wanted some documents and references. So I'll email that to you. We could get that out to them. So the last question is, what is the role of revolutionary nationalism in today's time? Do we need a resurgence in that consciousness to push demands for human rights abuses within the United States?
I'd like Dr. Horne to answer that. He is the scholar on international revolutions and movements. And I think that in terms of revolutionary nationalism, I don't know to what extent that he would like to share that, but I would like to at least get it started.
Well, thank you for that. I would say that there is a role for all progressive forces, and certainly that would include revolutionary nationalism. I would hope that revolutionary nationalists would learn all of the many lessons from past decades. And I would hope as well, as per my remarks, that within the Pan-Africanist context, that the revolutionary nationalists minimally would reach out to folks in Africa of a progressive persuasion, folks in the Caribbean of a progressive persuasion. And I think that's really what's lacking, is that on the one hand, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that the correlation of forces in the United States right now is rather negative, with the white right being on the march and, as noted, threatening to impose fascism. You would think that that realization, which many have, would lead to an acceleration of international outreach. But that's precisely what's missing, and that's precisely what makes me excited about this effort we're launching this week.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. Let me just add one more point to that. We have to understand what revolutionary nationalism means, right? Revolutionary nationalism means that we are building towards nationhood, right? The goals and objectives for which we are building towards is the idea of independence and nationhood, right? That's the goal. The method by which we do so is revolution. Now, I have shared this once before, and I'm going to share it again. The idea of revolution, right? Take the R off the word revolution, what you have. You have evolution, all right? So the processes by which we evolve from one state of existence to a higher state of existence, the evolutionary process is one of revolution, right? So there's no reason why any one of us would not want to proclaim ourselves as a revolutionary. If we indeed believe that we are moving our human experience from one level of existence to a higher and better level of existence, to a greater level of existence, that we are growing in the evolutionary processes, right? Which is social, political, and economic. The old will not die on its own. It has to be removed, all right? And the process of that removal is revolution. It's a revolutionary process. And so for us, those who identify themselves as revolutionary nationalists, then the goal for us is to evolve from a position of a colonized mentality to a decolonized mentality, right? That's the evolutionary process, right? That is when we begin to identify ourselves outside of the parameters from which we have been indoctrinated by the United States. From the time when we said pledge to allegiance to the time when we said we are no longer identify ourselves as Americans, right? That we will not no longer uphold the idea of capitalist imperialism. That's what as American is. Second of all, keep this in mind. If you go, and anyone who got a computer, Google 28 USC 3002 and see what it tells you. It tells you that the United States is what? A federal corporation. So essentially what we are is citizens of a corporation. We are citizens of a corporation. And that's the reason why corporations are more powerful and more important to us than human beings. Right? The United States Supreme Court in Hobby Lobby decision stated that corporations is what? A people. Said corporations are people. That's law. So if you understand the dynamics of our relationship to the government, right, as a corporation, right, we are corporate citizens. And this is the reason why corporations and property is more important than people. Profit is more important than people. Understand that. All right? We have been duped in this understanding of our relationship to the government as citizens. But the government in and of itself is a corporation. Right? And they function as that capacity. And that's the reason why corporations is more important than people. All right? So let's de-illusion ourselves, right? Because we have been deluded into this understanding in our relationship to this sovereignty, this idea of sovereignty of the United States and its corporate practices throughout the world. Okay. And so identifying oneself as revolutionary nationalist is to identify ourselves to no longer be part of the citizenship of a corporation, but to actually build a nation. Any more questions for us, Emo?
That is it. Appreciate you, Jalil. And then we'll just pass it off to Tag to close this out.
Well, I will keep it very concise. It speaks for itself. Y'all seeing what we seen tonight and heard, and all of the just surfeit of information and analysis and all that we need as far as the drawing from the long history of the giants whose shoulders we continue to stand upon and move with and through, and with the support of. And in hearing all that we heard from the panelists, I just want to hone in on a couple of phrases, or a few phrases that struck me in particular, among many others. But the discussion of the fourth world and the importance of prophecy. Also, this question of food apartheid, as well as organizational heft, and the importance and the need to analyze, to have the analysis before we charge, as well as the fact that the world is waiting on us, and that there needs to be a new narrative in this country, which involves this question of the People's Senate, which we will continue to raise up as we go into the tribunal in October and beyond. And so I just want to thank everyone who has participated tonight and who's participated in all of the webinars up to now, and will continue to build with us as we go into October 22nd's tribunal. And again, as we move through that tribunal and continue to build, and the real heavy lifting and work begins once we're through with that tribunal, and we begin to build the People's Senate and continue to utilize this as the critical organizing mechanism and vehicle that it is. And so thank you so much to our panelists for laying so much out there. Please, everyone, recognize that all of the webinars are archived. And so you can find all of these webinars on the website, spiritofmandela.org. We also have plenty of audio-visual material that you could find on the website, spiritofmandela.org, as well as all of our social media platforms, as well as on Vimeo, where all of our videos are currently posted, and we will continue to post those. So I just want to again thank our illustrious panel. Thank you so much, Emuk, for holding us down with the intro and facilitation. And absolutely, especially to all of you who are participating now and who will check this in the future and continue to help us to build in the spirit of Mandela. Appreciate you all so much. And we will continue to move forward and look out for the next and all of the additional activities and audiovisual material that we will continue to produce and put out as we go into the tribunal and beyond.
Assalamu alaikum. All power to the people.
All power to the people.